Here are a few clips of Sam Harris's last podcast, where he has a discussion with Douglas Murray. The podcast is interesting and revolves around the topic of immigration and Douglas Murray's book, The Strange Death of Europe: Immigration, Identity, Islam. Specifically, they are discussing how free discussion and conversation is being stifled by many who claim that anyone who questions the benefit of open immigration is racist or bigoted. The pressure to silence any criticism that can be seen as racist at all has contributed to undermining police investigations and will continue to put others at risk. As Sam Harris points out towards the end, if we are willing to sacrifice our daughters and our neighbors' daughters with a misguided belief that we are just and tolerant, is there anything that we would consider too great a cost? Where can we draw the line?
What I'd like to point out is that neither of us are against immigration, and we're not against Muslim immigration. In fact, both of us count among our friends Muslims and former Muslims who are precisely the sorts of people we are most concerned to protect. And in particular, we're worried about protecting them from many of the illiberal people who have been pouring into Europe. The hypocrisy here on the left is fairly breathtaking, because you have the same people who are most concerned about women's rights and gay rights, and even, as you describe, even more niche concerns, now transgender rights and getting your pronouns straight. I mean, these are the kind of the highest moral priorities at this moment. These are the very people who seem quite happy to import millions of people into their society for whom the very notion of women's rights and gay rights, and to say nothing of transgender rights, is not only foreign but anathema. There's a doublethink here that everyone is paying a massive penalty for, even the, and this is a point you also make in the book, when you look at the most vulnerable people in these immigrant communities. I mean, so the liberal Muslims and the gay Muslims and the apostates and the Muslim reformers, the people who threaten their lives, right, who make their lives an actual safety concern from one moment to the next, are not, by and large, the fascists and the neo-Nazis and the bigots and the xenophobes. It's the intolerant Muslims who are being brought into the same community.
The most visceral and terrible example of this inability to talk to the bad things that happened emerged in different countries at different times. And in my telling, it emerged really first in the UK. And that was the scandal that subsequently became known as the Rotherham scandal. This was around 2004. And at the time, there was actually a Channel 4 documentary that was meant to, because finally, some journalists took a real interest in this. And Channel 4 was meant to broadcast a documentary about this, what became known as the grooming gangs scandal. And it was actually stopped from broadcasting at the request of local police, among others, who feared that it would be a recruiting sergeant for the British National Party at forthcoming elections. So that the documentary was cancelled. It was subsequently shown after elections and at a time that was deemed to be less volatile. But that episode spoke to a sort of general issue, which was that people really didn't want to know about these stories. These were largely, it was thought, these were events that were happening in northern towns, outside the sort of metropolitan London bubble. And so they were easier to ignore for a lot of people. But within the last decade, it became increasingly hard to ignore it. And eventually, the government set up an official inquiry into what went wrong. And it turned out that in the town of Rotherham alone, up to 1,400 young girls had been systematically groomed and raped, often gang raped, by gangs of Muslim men, largely of Pakistani origin. And it was the official inquiry into this, the government inquiry, found that the fear of accusations of racism, as it were, penetrated and prevented the police and local authorities acting on this, even when the local outcry was really very, very strong indeed. And it gets worse because, unfortunately, as we all know, like the Catholic Church rape scandals and with all sorts of other similar cases, sadly, what happens is the first story breaks, and then you learn the width of the problem. And this, in the last a few years, it's turned out that there were similar cases in towns across the north of England, and in places that people thought to be more leafy and green. In Oxfordshire, most people think Oxford, dreaming spires, etc., etc. In Oxfordshire, there was a case 5 years ago now that came to trial, the Operation Bullfinch case, where numerous young white girls, again often underage, had been trafficked for sex by Muslim gangs. And I mean, the details that came out of that trial at the Old Bailey in London included, for instance, that one of the men branded one of the girls on her backside, I think, with an M for Muhammad, which was his name. He branded her as his property. And again, these cases, when they came to trial, they just, for the reasons that you and I feel awkward talking about it, the British state, the British people felt awkward and wanted them not to be true. But this was just the same story in a way that then later emerged after, I mean, much faster between it being covered up and coming out, but of similar events at, for instance, music festivals in Sweden in recent years, where it wasn't till Cologne on New Year's Eve 2015 that when the large-scale assaults happened, famously in front of the cathedral on New Year's Eve, that then the Swedes, sort of having reported that, turned round and some of the press said, "Oh yeah, didn't that happen at our music festivals in recent years?" And everyone, "Oh yeah, that did." So it's a real scandal, and it's an ongoing scandal. There are still many cases coming to trial. I think there's a lot more to find out, but it is just a symbol, a symptomatic example of this deep discomfort of this whole discussion. Because if you or I had been asked to invent a sort of gross, racist sort of favorite trope, it would be, well, they'd complain about people coming over here and raping our women. And I think that's one of the reasons that that it's been so little covered. I have a friend who's a journalist who mentioned to me just a few days ago that he went to interview some of the victims in Rotherham, actually, and he said he thought by now, as it were, their stories, they'd be talked out about their stories. They've been interviewed so many times. Not so. These women now, even now, have basically not had a chance to tell their story to the press or anyone else, because people just really don't want to know this stuff. And one of the points in my book is that, everyone knows the benefits of some migration, but the downside bits we're still not really willing to face up to. And I mean, that is it at its absolute most base and worst.
I mean, again, this story just puts me at the absolute limit of what I find believable. The fact that this happened, I'm thinking now specifically about Rotherham. I mean, the numbers of people in this small town and the parents having to, appeal to the police for years and nothing comes of it, right? The fact that the authorities stood by and let this happen year after year.
There are so many. I mean, I detest your listeners' patience if I gave too many examples, but I mean, let me give you an example from the Oxfordshire case I mentioned, which is, it's sort of in the UK, it's less well known than Rotherham, which has become really well known in the UK. But in the Oxfordshire case, there was a girl who, because quite often the young girls were bribed with drugs and things, or plied with drugs and alcohol and so on. There's one case of a girl who was actually in a care home in Oxford, and she was being gang raped, and she managed to escape, and she got back to the children's home she was in, meant to be being looked after by local authorities, and she didn't have the money for the taxi that she had managed to hail to get her back to the care home. And the care home staff thought that she was just playing up, as it were. The taxi driver took her back, and she was gang raped again. I mean, it's sort of wholesale failure of, I think this is why it particularly has begun to, or at least has for time, some people really speak to a greater failing, because we'd like to think, I think, that young people, particularly young people in trouble in care homes and things, are actually the people the state should most look after and care for, and that at that stage there's such a total lack of care that you could end up basically facilitating that is, I think, horrifying.
what is illustrative and perhaps even diagnostic about this case for me is that, and again, it really strains credulity on every level, is that the fact that it's possible, the fact that you have really a whole society being willing to just eat this horror year after year and do nothing about it, that suggests to me that other things are possible. And this kind of great unraveling that you sound like a scaremonger to worry about is possible. What freedom wouldn't you be willing to forfeit if you're willing to let your daughters and your neighbors' daughters by the thousands get gang raped for years?
Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a comment and hit that like button. If you didn't like it, please explain why. Open discussion is the only way to have a better understanding of differing views. Sharing this video on social media can help keep conversations alive. Now, here are a few other videos that you may be interested in.